for everyone joining us. We appreciate your time and attention to this. I know many of you probably are working on some urgent responses right now to what is happening in Ukraine. Thank you again for joining us. I will move on from the title slide. I think you've all stared at it long enough. And I will quickly move on from this slide as well because Babak made such a nice introduction. I'll just give a quick note here that both Shelia and I are connected with Ukraine. I'm Ukrainian American, and Shelia has worked with and in Ukraine for many, many years. So this is a personal time of turmoil in addition to professional. And I will be sharing some anecdotes and information that I wouldn't have done if we stuck with the original schedule and have done this presentation a month ago, just because so much has shifted in the time being, sadly. I'll hand off to Shelia for the introduction to Irex very briefly.
Great, thank you very much, Katya. As everyone can see here on this slide about Irex, we are a global development organization and global development and education organization working currently in more than 120 countries around the world. We primarily focus on cultivating leaders, empowering youth, strengthening institutions, primarily civil society, but also we work with public sector and private sector, and increasing access to quality education and reliable, credible information. Irex was established 50 years ago. Actually, our original mandate was academic and research exchanges with the USSR. So as Katya mentioned, the relevance of today's war in Ukraine is both immediate and very painful. At Irex, as well as in many other organizations and among citizens of the world, Putin's assault is very clearly recognized as the direct result of the hybrid warfare, which has been carried on for decades. Hybrid warfare in which disinformation and hate speech have been weaponized in support of the Kremlin's geopolitical aims. Unfortunately, such means of warfare thrive where censorship reigns and educational systems neglect critical thinking and information literacy skills. At Irex, we're extremely familiar with the countries in the space of the former Soviet Union, and we will be sharing many examples over the course of this presentation. But sadly, Eurasia is far from the only place where this sort of hybrid warfare thrives. Katya?
Apologies, my screen has completely, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
All of my screens are frozen and I can't do anything right now. I'm going to try stop share and see nothing's happening. So I don't know what just happened. It just happened as you were speaking, Shelia. Shelia, I wonder if you have the capacity to quickly pull the presentation from the SharePoint.
Okay,
I have no idea what just happened.
Yeah,
cannot do anything. While Shelia is doing that, I can tell you a little bit about the next slide that I was planning to discuss. The slide just shows the map of all of our the map of all of the places where we implement Learn to Discern, just to say that the lessons that we will share, in addition to the countries that Babak has kindly mentioned, Ukraine, Jordan, Serbia, we now have a portfolio of these programs in over 20 countries. These are here on the map. These are programs that implement these Learn to Discern approach, which is an approach to building human resilience to disinformation. And Shelia and I are just representatives of a cadre of about 100 people globally, who most of whom work in the countries where these approaches are implemented. So this is not, we are the tip of the iceberg of the work that's being done, and everything that we will share in the subsequent slides is based on that practice. I also, before we jump into the agenda and the lessons, I do want to highlight the significance of Ukraine and this conversation because of what is happening right now. We started this work in Ukraine in response to the attack in Donetsk and Lugansk and in Crimea, and the accompanying propaganda that flooded those regions and the Russian-speaking populations through traditional and social media sources in 2013, 14, 15. Our original program, which we designed as a rapid response back then, was called Propaganda Proof. we didn't stick with it. We renamed it to Learn to Discern eventually, but it was designed for adults to understand when they're being manipulated into making bad decisions, like voting in the breakaway referenda or supporting the violence. And it was extremely effective because it was the very first program back then, and we have combed through tens of different versions of media literacy curricula to come up with a program. It was the first one that recognized that you can't just tell people what's wrong and what's right, or give them some kind of general guidelines and expect that they will change their minds, because the root of this really is in our beliefs and in how we react to information on a very human, cognitive, and emotional level. And so what we are seeing today in Ukraine is that Ukrainians are resilient. I'm in touch with many there, and I'm so heartbroken about what they're experiencing, but also I'm so proud about the warnings they give me on how not to fall for fakes, how to not share information before checking it. These are people hiding in shelters. At the same time, and this is where I am sharing a very personal experience, the rest of my family is in Russia. There is my extended family, and none of them are listening to me. And I can't break through, even when I apply all of the best recommendations and guidelines on how to talk to someone on the other side of the divide, right? All the sessions we've had on how to talk to someone who is vaccine hesitant or is a conspiracy theorist in the US, where you connect on an issue, where you listen, where you don't fight, where you try to, none of it works, because this is the result of decades of the educational system being used as a propaganda vehicle of fear, oppression, and of just this very human need in these Russians to believe that they're good people. The biases prevent them actively from actually believing what they see and what people who they've known all of their life and trusted with everything beforehand. And so I see that this conversation is very important in understanding that while we need to be responding on all fronts to disinformation, technology, policy, regulation, sanctions, whatever it takes at this point, cyber responses, this human resilience and overcoming that human resistance to fact-based information when it comes to something like this is extremely important and not to be undermined. And we all need to think ahead. Where are places where this open-mindedness and ability to engage with information, with overcoming your own bias and awareness in a way that benefits you, where is this not happening? Where is the next foundation of conflict? Where is the next support based for atrocity? So with this intro, apologies, this has taken longer. I did not plan originally on doing this, but it's just everything that's happening today leads me to believe that this is an important context. So on the next slide, Shelia.
Did it advance? Yeah, I'm trying to advance it. There we are.
Yes.
Sorry.
We'll briefly go over the agenda.
Yes, thank you. We've provided a brief overview of the need for resilience to information manipulation online, focusing in particular on Ukraine, but clearly this is a global issue. The remainder of our presentation will be broken into two main parts. We will share 9 lessons learned about building resilience to information manipulation online from Irex's work in many countries around the world, with specific examples for each of those lessons learned. And following that, we hope to have approximately 20 minutes. We'll see how quickly we get through the material to discuss with all of you those lessons, your reflections on those lessons. And then also we welcome questions, and in particular, a discussion amongst all of us on any gaps and needs for additional research and investment in these sorts of practical approaches to counter disinformation and online hate speech.
Thank you, Sheila. So we will tag team throughout the lessons. So I'll cover the next couple before handing this off back to Shelia. But in total, there are 9 of this that we've learned. There's probably going to be a lot more just following our most recent experience, but we will go over what we have found out. So first of all, I want to break us out of any misconceptions around the fact that very often learn to discern and this kind of work generally is associated with media literacy, because what we find that competencies to resist manipulation and build resilience to disinformation are complex, and they go beyond one single discipline, whether it's news literacy, whether it's digital literacy, whether it's media literacy. The one term does not capture what is what's the context of what people need, what kind of skills humans need to navigate today's informational environment in a way that is safe for them and others, that is responsible in terms of understanding their gatekeeper function in the informational space, in terms of what's healthy for their own well-being, anxiety, associated behaviors, what's critical, how to assess what's credible, what's not, and what's empathy-driven to fight off that kind of built-in triggering function of social media, especially, which spills over into traditional media as well. So we have come up with a list of competencies for our education programs and our training and skill building programs that include, but are not limited to, things such as digital safety and security, hate speech, empathy, digital empathy, civic engagement, media literacy, news literacy, of course, but also creativity, open-mindedness. And all of these are kind of secondary to more kind of even background and more common to the general education competencies such as critical and analytic thinking and emotional regulation. We found that even if you teach those 3 first, critical analytic thinking and emotional regulation on how you engage with information, that is already a very solid foundation for just better, more informed engagement with information. Particularly cognitive reflection is something that has been found and confirmed to be effective and a predictor of decreased vulnerability to disinformation and hate speech and fake news, because it is this ability to suppress an immediate but often wrong reaction to information and take your time and think. And when we are stressed, when we experience high volume of information, when that information is emotionally triggering, we often don't take that time. Our thinking is not happening. What is happening is a very a fight, flight, or freeze response generated in the ancient part of our brain. So to do that, you do need that emotional regulation. So that's the first thing. And I am very happy to see that a lot of the more contemporary media literacy, news media literacy, digital literacy competencies recognize that. But that is often a misconception we still have to fight when we talk about media literacy, is that it's not simple. It's not one discipline. It actually involves a lot of other things. We do have an example of a tactic that we include that is borrowed from psychology. It's called Name It to Tame It. I was actually delighted to see it taught in elementary schools in the US as part of just general coping mechanism for kids this young age who are living through the pandemic. But it's just to show the kind of the interdisciplinarity of what kind of skills we mean for resilience. Name It to Tame It is something that encourages participants, learners, to name the emotion that they're experiencing so that they can reclaim their executive brain function. The process of naming, whether it is I'm feeling anger, frustration, disgust, helps us to actually move the brain resources from that amygdala to the frontal executive brain function centers and think about the situation. And I'm not saying it works every time, but it is a useful reminder for everyone. So we're going to move on to the next slide.
Sorry.
This is the next lesson, is that, and even I, in my talking right now, heavily focused on kind of the education and learners, which would lead a lot of people to believe that it needs to happen in schools, which is absolutely true. we do need these efforts, these competencies to build through the education systems desperately, because these are the most powerful at scale skill building systems globally. However, this hate speech, disinformation targets everyone, and there are people who make decisions today who are outside of that school system. So there needs to be concerted effort to build these competencies among audiences who are outside of the school system. So partnerships with whatever they are, these organizations, institutions, and vehicles that reach adult populations, those who make decisions today, policymakers, heads of institutions, business and public leaders, heads of households, parents, caregivers, they need to happen now. We've had good experience working with adults in many ways. It's often all about finding the right incentives to make sure that they come to the learning. And sometimes it's saying to them that we don't doubt that they are really great at this, but they're in charge of others. And so if they learn this so that they could pass these skills on to others, like their students or their children or grandchildren, that's an incentive. But there are others as well. But we all need to be creative about making sure that this human capacity to operate in the system happens not only in schools, which that doesn't happen enough already, but also in institutions that work with adult learners. We do have an example of how we do that in some places globally. We haven't been able to apply this in the US as of yet, but in places like North Macedonia and Latin America and the Caribbean, we are working in countries of the Latin America and the Caribbean region. We are working with local partners who are completely outside of the of your what you would think of traditional media literacy related industries. We are working with organizations that are providing employment, career growth services, and other kind of professional development, to see how they integrate that skill building into the work with the audiences and the constituents that they serve. We need to be more creative about thinking how to work with other organizations that focus on human rights and other civil society, as well as businesses, on how to build this with adults. So that was lesson number 2. For lesson number 3, we're going to shift to Shelia.
Great, thanks, Katya. So lesson number 3 may seem common sense at first. This notion that different audiences, even within a community or within the same age group, engage with information differently. So it's very widely recognized, for example, that youth predominantly use social media to interact with and get news, whereas adults typically consume a combination of social and traditional media, such as TV, print, and radio. Beyond this, however, our work at Irex and research done around the world has really underscored that malevolent actors deliberately craft disinformation to exploit social identity-based differences and demographic factors, so gender, race, ethnicity, language, political affiliation, the list goes on. We know that social media platforms are very adept at leveraging individuals' multiplicity of identities to target content, and disinformation is no different. Hate speech may be targeted at an entire social identity group or at individuals who are singled out based on demographic factors and their own specific opinions and activities in real life and online. We see a great deal of research, for example, that females who are very active in the public space, both in person and online, as elected officials, as journalists, call out an enormous amount of misogynistic hate speech directed towards them in their professional capacity, as well as very personalized and sexualized attacks. That's one example. There are so many more. The evidence base is slowly growing on approaches that apply an intersectional lens to determine how best to build the resilience of diverse individuals to this disinformation and to mitigate its differential impacts linked to social identity and demographic factors. But there's definitely a need for additional research because contextual nuances are crucial. We've seen this in terms of attacks around elections in Europe as well as the US, where, for example, voters of color were deliberately targeted with disinformation specific to races at the very local level. When we're crafting our responses as practitioners, it's really important to work with local organizations that know these nuances. One example from Irex's work is our Very Verified online game, where we had included examples of hate speech and harmful stereotypes to ensure that the game and the examples it used would really resonate with users, for example, in Ukraine. But we also had to be really careful when calibrating those examples to make them familiar, to not unintentionally reinforce identity-based stereotypes and therefore cause additional harm. Very closely related to that lesson is that the way in which we're building skills is very important, that we are looking at multiple platforms, multiple learning styles that are as diverse as those individuals and those groups with whom we're working. That we are as intentional in our inclusivity as the malevolent actors are in their disinformation campaigns and targeting strategies. It's really important to think about incentives and motivations. Every individual's incentive for picking up new skills and putting them into practice will be different. If we look at just one aspect of identity, again, let's take age, it's abundantly clear that motivations to adopt new skills and actually apply those new skills vary along the life cycle. So as program designers, we're always assessing different motivations so that those motivations inform the variety of formats, platforms, and pathways to learning that we offer. For example, games and play-based explorative learning work really well with children. Adolescents respond really well to peer-led knowledge sharing and creative digital formats for their skills building. And when Irex works with young adults, we really consciously, intentionally tap their interest in both professional and personal growth, often through self-led or self-paced formats. Additional layers can be added, as Katya was describing under lesson 2, based on occupational and other incentive systems, things like continuing education for educators, librarians, frontline medical, and other responders. Many occupations have built-in continuing education requirements, and adding information literacy as part of that can help. Another example here is the ways in which learn to discern competencies are adapting to use different formats and platforms. We have used some of these play-based programs that I mentioned, as well as peer-to-peer trainings. We also use high schools and universities as partners, and looking at ways in which we can align with both national and local curriculum standards so that education is infused with critical information engagement competencies. We also have looked at online courses, video-based courses, chatbots, social media-based content, and adult education and training programs. We've worked with very diverse organizations and local communities to help us train trainers, from librarians whom I've mentioned and educators to also unions, also volunteers who are already active in volunteer-based civil society organizations. In some countries, we've also worked with groups of mothers and in very informal ways. Anyone who can be conceived of and plays a role as an influencer in their community can help us understand incentives and motivations and leverage those for more effective programs. Back to you, Katya.
Thank you, Sheila. So this is also something that would be intuitive, but somehow is not, because we receive multiple questions often. Why can't we just take what you already have? Why does it have to take you another 3 months to tailor every time we go to a new place? And that is because the content of any curriculum that would then be layered into the formats, adjusted formats that Sheila just described, also needs to be different and adjusted every time for every different audience, even within one country. We work in Sri Lanka and we have several different versions of the same Learn to Discern curriculum because the pain points are different for different audiences. They're targeted with different narratives and different tactics. and because we also need to do no harm. So there are two kind of considerations for the tailoring of the content. One is for uptake and effectiveness with the learners, and the second one is to recognize the environment in which we are doing this. So on the environment side, the considerations for content adaptation are that it needs to be neutral. That's number one premise of our Learn to Discern work, and why we are able to work in some very difficult contexts and operate our programs even in countries that are awash with homemade propaganda, because we are always extremely neutral. And that's number one premise, is we never tell people in our work, and it's the guidance that goes over to all the trainers, is to not point to what is a good thing and what is a bad thing, but instead build the capacity to tell and identify the signs when something is manipulative and when something is not. Now, I will step back here and say, when we work in Ukraine now, we are providing links to credible information ourselves as well. In a situation where there is open conflict, where there is a need for credible, good sources of information, and there's a need to get them urgently to people, that is definitely something that has to be done. But for Learn to Discern programs, for the nudging, the pre-bunking that we do as part of that, we still focus on the signs that you're being manipulated, recognizing when this occurs, how to resist it, what are the tactics. So that neutrality has allowed us to work with audiences that would have otherwise walked away from us. If we told them we're going to change your mind about what to consume, they wouldn't even listen. And they're often the ones who need this most. So neutrality is one. Understanding political landscape and sensitivities in the policy environment. That has implications both for content and for the format. If the country has vehicles to build this into the education systems on multiple levels, that's great. If it doesn't, then we will be spinning our wheels trying to create lesson plans if the system is not open. So kind of understanding that from the start. Third one is origins and the pain points of disinformation. It never happens in isolation too. So for the stakeholders in any context where you operate this, to allow this program to happen and for it to be effective, we need to understand what are the parameters. On the learner side, the content of the curriculum needs to be resonant. As Shelia said, we need to have examples that want people to stay engaged, yet they cannot be painful. They cannot be immediately attacking something that's extremely divisive in the community, because if you do that early in the program, you will lose participants and your workshops and lessons and whatever. However we are doing this will dissolve into conflict and debate instead of a productive learning. So resonance and neutrality, but with a Socratic method built into the gradual acquisition of the gradual transition from awareness to knowledge to skill to habit and to behavior change, with people at first exposed to examples that are maybe emotionally removed from them, and they're able to recognize it, to then come in closer and closer to home, but eventually them themselves identifying manipulation in their information streams. That's what we've seen work, and that's what's the recommended consideration when adapting the content of these type of programs to any particular environment. I'll move on to the next lesson. I think that's also me. This is something to what Babak has pointed out at the start of this conversation, the need for both long-term and short-term strategies. I'll start with the easier one to tackle. The long-term resilience building is extremely important. We see what happens when there is no long-term investment in building these kind of competencies in educational systems and other systems. So this is in a way a call to action to engage educational institutions in this now throughout the globe, in the US. I know US is difficult. There is a lot of decentralization in the education system, and it has to be state by state. And I know there are organizations like Media Literacy Now that work hard to make sure that the standards are built into the education system. That is very, very important, because if you don't have the plan for this long-term resilience building, we're always going to be stuck in the short-term reactive response. But there is a way to have the short-term strategies as well. Before I move on, I do have an example of our work in Ukraine. So we have managed, in the aftermath of the original attack, I would say, on Ukraine in 2014-15, Ukraine recognized the need to build this resilience. And after our work with adults, we were able to work with the Ministry of Education to take this at scale to the education system. So we have been working before everything fell apart as the war commenced, with over 650 schools at this point, to infuse the way that instruction happens in middle and high school levels of subjects such as history, language, literature, multiple subjects, infuse the competencies that I've described into instruction of this subject. So not adding a specific extracurricular activity or a standalone subject that often places a burden on the education system, and it's really hard to make happen without redirecting resources from elsewhere. There are ways to do this. We are trying to convince more education systems to do that. They don't have to work with us. We don't care who they work with, but it's a call to action to do this and follow the example of countries such as Finland and other Nordic countries that have been fighting Kremlin disinformation for decades and have recognized this need for long-term resilience building. So the next slide is more on what can be done on the short term and what kind of responses can happen quickly. So first of all, to kind of wrap up the skill building, you can work with adults. As I described earlier, we have found ways, and I'm sure others have as well, to reach adult learners, decision makers, those who are in charge of information flows, who can use them to make decisions today and shape opinions in their communities. To Sheila's point about incentives, there's a way to do that. We shouldn't give up on humans. That's one of the criticism we often face when confronted with choices. Go with something tech-based or something human-based. Somehow we all humans think it's really difficult to change humans. It is not the case. We have built very successful adult-focused interventions to quickly provide the skills to not be manipulated to decision makers. But with the content of this slide is more to the point of what else could be done when there's even less time, when you can't have any type of, you can't get people on a series of workshops, and really there's an attack on the information space. Here I would like to highlight the work that we've done with the RAND Corporation. It was a randomized controlled trial. It happened in the US in the lead up to the 2020 elections. And the study looked at the efficacy of media literacy nudging messages on reducing engagement with disinformation about elections. What we found is that, well, first of all, the study found that people do engage with disinformation on a very emotional level. Disinformation triggers their feelings of pride or disgust or anger to engage on narratives that are anti-democratic, that want to suppress vote or to sway the vote in a certain direction. RAND took our content, our media literacy content, which was just an explainer of how a manipulation is enabled through algorithms, how confirmation bias works. So very, very neutral, completely unrelated to the election or any campaign content, solely focused on revealing how some of the features of social media, for example, are conducive to more manipulative information. We had a couple of short videos under 45 seconds long and memes, social media cards, and participants in the study were exposed to this content as well as other social advertising content, so climate change, other things. So they didn't know that they are looking at media literacy content or participating in a media literacy study specifically. There was all sorts of other memes. However, even with all of that, the study found that especially the very partisan news consumers on the far right and the far left on the US political spectrum significantly reduced the engagement with Kremlin disinformation around US elections, subsequent exposure of media literacy messaging. This has huge implications in terms of the ability to do something fast, if not to debunk and correct, but to reduce engagement and sharing of bad information in a situation where the information space is flooded with bad information. So we are doing this, we're actively applying this lesson now in many places in the region surrounding Ukraine and Russia, and try to quickly alert and direct people away from sharing bad information and consuming it themselves. So next lesson, please. This is an important lesson that's related to that environment considerations that I've mentioned earlier. Like individuals, governments and systems have biases and priorities that might oppose media literacy. This is based on my conversations with industry leaders here in the US, including the RAND Corporation, including Media Literacy Now and other advocates. The term media literacy has become politicized in the US. And there is opposition to media literacy interventions in some states based on this perceived partisanship. In many other places, there are other obstacles. If the regimes in countries where this is a need themselves are using disinformation as a vehicle for the advancement of their goals, they're going to oppose something like this. We found, however, that there is always ways to be able to operate and build these skills if we step away from thinking of this type of work as just media literacy, but focus more on what competencies are being built, going back again to critical thinking, going back to analytic thinking, emotional regulation, and the other host of literacies that go with this, including digital literacy and cybersecurity. For places where this might be not top of mind, but where they do recognize kind of more perceivably hard threat of cyber attacks, wrapping these competencies into cybersecurity trainings, for example, is a very effective approach. Or in places where there might be not a perceived threat to disinformation, but there are high levels of anxiety and concerns about well-being of young children, and all of the studies of how overwhelming social media and digital engagement has negative consequences for our well-being. Digital well-being, this is a new stream of our work, which we are deepening this year in many places where we work. Digital well-being and self-care is something that also can teach all of these competencies, but in that format. So there's different ways to overcome these biases if we are aware of them. And finally, my last slide before we open up for the discussion is on the importance of evaluation and having standards to ensure equitable access and quality of these interventions. And the point on equity is something that I want to specifically call out. We are seeing, and the UNESCO flagged this as well, increased inequity in access to this kind of skills globally. There are places where governments, systems, organizations recognize the need to equip human beings to operate in this environment, and there are resources. Overwhelmingly, these resources are produced, distributed in North America, Western Europe. These are wealthy countries that are on alert. So there's this global inequity in the amount of resources and attention to this. There's overwhelmingly the conversations, including this one, is happening in the powerful places, and we don't have enough representation from and I'm not meaning specifically this one, but just all the panels and all the conversations I've been having. Increasingly, there are alarms about not having enough voices from underrepresented places, as well as resources directed towards them and significant funding. the thing is, I've observed multiple small pots of money being available for media literacy in places where we work, and you just can't expect to throw a little bit of money on something and have a high quality systems level approach developed as a result of it. This is where evaluation comes in, having standards, having expectations for behavior change, and having tools and mechanisms on how to measure it. As an industry are key. We have attempted to do this by taking standard media literacy, indicators and tools such as new media knowledge, locus of control, and expanding them to adjust for this new environment. But more work needs to be done. The paper goes in more detail on the current restrictions on how we are able to evaluate what is traditionally called media literacy, but no longer is just that. But this is, again, a call to action, especially for those of you in academia, to look a little bit closer at what we're able to do, both in terms of evaluation and including more robust, sustainable ways to build these competencies globally, because it's no longer a matter of just one country's struggle against disinformation. It's a global security concern implication, just as what we're seeing in Ukraine. Because I really do believe that without assurance of support for this war in Russia, Putin wouldn't have maybe attempted it. And maybe it's just the pressure from inside that is also needed to have him stop. I'm not being completely rational and analytic on this, being Ukrainian, but I do think the fact that currently 60% of Russians support it is telling. And this is just one study. There's probably many more that have different statistics. But I'll wrap up and pass on to Shelia for questions, reflection, and discussions with this, again, kind of call to action to recognize that we need the competencies to navigate the space in a way that protects ourselves and others, that it needs to be empathy driven, that it needs to be responsible, and it needs to be critical. And we, as much as we also need to invest in other solutions, this one is something that should be top of mind. Because we're all, at the end of the day, people making decisions, and we need the right skills to be able to make them. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Katya. We'll now open it up for questions, reflections, any comments you'd like to kick off discussion. I can either review the chat or I can screen share. Maybe Katya, you can review the chat there. Please also feel free to unmic if you'd like to ask a question.
I just want to take this chance to thank you again for your presentation as we open up for questions and discussions. I could also start off with a question myself. I was it's very interesting the point you made about how people in Russia, including people who are members of your own family, Katya, thank you for sharing that point, are very difficult to convince when it comes to misinformation. And you mentioned also that 60% of people in Russia, believe the war is, support the war. So what do you do in that kind of situation? Can you do anything if people's minds are made? I mean, there's a lot of research on media effects that shows that when people's minds are made on a question they consider of high importance, it's very hard to change their point of view. So what can you do? Can you do anything?
Maybe both Shelia and I can answer, because we might have complementary points on this, but I can start. I think what we know about how this works is that people are exposed to repeated messages. People are exposed to these messages by channels that they're used to trusting. People are exposed to these messages by maybe they're more kind of local thought leaders, experts. So to get over that, I think we need to, as painful as it might be, but it needs to be a similar tactic, is to not give up and repeated telling of human stories to get the information out there. So to leverage that kind of, the more you hear something, the more acceptable it becomes. So to not give up on those human stories, to not maybe again, as difficult as that might be, to not try to attack in return, and bring in more, keep trying to find those trust vectors to change and to bring over to the other side. So figuring out how to get these messages into the channels that are consumed, to be picked up by voices that have followings, which is easier said than done, given now the security implications for anyone who speaks up against this in Russia. So we can't make people do this. We'd be wrong on many, many levels, but I just think that just keeping at it and keeping kind of that human connection. Initiatives like the one set up in Lithuania, where you can just dial a number, it will go to a random Russian and attempt to have a conversation if they don't hang up on you. Those kind of things, is to try to convince them to listen if they feel safe. Because again, I recognize that people are also afraid, and I don't know to what extent we can trust those surveys, because I don't know how truthfully people answer them, knowing the deep-rooted fear of the system that exists in that country.
Yeah, I would add there are different approaches depending on the operating environment. If you're in a space with very effective censorship, the way we've seen Russia, shutting down entire social media platforms, and places like Iran as well, where there are internet blackouts, and there is as good at knocking out VPNs as people are at finding new ones. That's very different than, say, in the United States, where the situation may be more the volume of information. But given that there are different approaches for different environments, a generalization could be, in addition to what Katya has said very correctly about trusted sources of information and leveraging those trusted sources being important, is to help people find some commonality. We've done this in Ukraine with intergenerational dialogues, where we trained youth, we call them media literacy drivers, to work with older members of their family or in their communities. And we know, all of us know, it's really tough if you have that uncle or that grandparent, right, who's just really entrenched in their views. Having a conversation where you're just providing information, providing facts, can often not work. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that, right? Information alone does not change opinions and habits. But if you can also give people skills to begin to work on debate and dialogue, where you can reassure them at the emotional level that your counter argument doesn't mean everything that they believe in, their very fundamental values, are being attacked or questioned. To the question about Russians supporting the war, for many people, especially the older generation, stability is absolutely number one. They're willing to believe because they desperately want there to be stability, and they don't want to repeat going through the 1990s, right? So if you can assure them that what is happening and acknowledging what is happening doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be a coup, a violent revolution, all of their worst fears. And for example, acknowledging, meeting them halfway. Yes, there is an alt-right within Ukraine, as there is in every country around the world nowadays, right? However, election results show that there's single-digit support for those movements. So again, if they have fears that there truly are Nazis in power in Ukraine, here's some evidence going back decades from verified sources where you can bring that to the fore and try to have a less emotional discussion. It's difficult, there's no silver bullet, but addressing the emotional as well as the factual through trusted intermediaries is kind of the general formula for success.
Great, thank you. Okay, other questions?
Yes, I have one. I was wondering, how do we best tackle our own biases as a person and as a company? Do the need to build resilience in those ways? I'm always wondering, what are my biases? What am I missing that I should be thinking a different way about? So interested in that.
Thank you, Suzanne, for that question. The fact that you are always wondering and always asking is already an amazing step in the right direction, and actually probably the biggest step that anyone can take. And that's what we try to do with our work as well, to make people recognize that they have biases and that we might never be able to be, you can't be completely unbiased ever. There's always going to be something. And that's where, when we have our modules, depending on how it's rolled out, depending on the format, on talking about biases, we start by exposing how bias shows up from others, what biases we would see built in by someone else into the information that's presented to them. Something as innocuous and fun as going over the evolution of the Disney princesses, for example, over the year, shows the societal bias towards what women's role and expectations of them are in a society. And it's really fun because people like to look at images. There's discussions about the evolution and where it's headed and why it's happening. And then from there, it's easier to make a leap into looking at our own biases, what we might be bringing into our both informational engagement and consumption. And there are a couple of exercises that we do on how to do that practically. I can share the link to our manual that's designed for the US that kind of goes over that a little bit. But it is an important conversation. As part of some of our own training workshops, we like people to take the implicit bias test. That's it's for the English-speaking populations. It's easy because it's free, it's online, it's a Harvard project. And if you're not aware of it yet, you probably are, but I can also send the link in the chat. That kind of just highlights how we all have this, and it's not a reflection on one being a bigot, but it's just a part of human nature. And then going over these biases. And secondly, we do have a very robust module on recognizing what kind of biases are out there, because when we say bias, many people will just think of one or two things, but there are many biases and a lot of them are hidden. So kind of starting to go over some of these things, such as again, like they already mentioned, the repetition bias, which means the more you see something, the more familiar it becomes to your brain, the easier it is to recall, the more easy it is to accept as true. The endorsement bias, which means anytime when on the TV or in social media you see experts say, our brain likes to default to, okay, well, someone fact checked this, someone has smarter than me who's an expert says, so it must be true, right? Then there is the already well-known confirmation bias. There are the stereotypes, which is also a type of a bias. So there's many of these things. I have actually a recorded session we did for the Name the Conference this year that goes over some of these biases. I can also send a link to that. But I would actually say that the bias and the stereotype one is one of the funner ways to engage with this content, because it's very individual focused and we really love learning about ourselves. People really like to talk about their own selves. Like if there's a quiz you can build, what type of media consumer you are, like it's very individual centered. So as long as it's not perceived as threatening of judging self, but kind of being open to understanding, it's a very fun way. So I'll share a couple of resources and follow up, but I wonder, Shelia, if you have something to add as well from the Jessie Lens and your Ukraine experience.
Yeah, one thing that I was just thinking of is recently how active I've been on social media related to the war, and starting to notice already how the algorithms are picking up on my biases. That can often be really helpful to pay attention to what's being fed to you outside of your normal echo chamber. We all have an echo chamber. And that can really alert you to the fact that you have been reacting in emotional ways to very particular types of content. So in addition to just understanding bias in an abstract sense, responding to a trend in the news can also be really apparent if you pause and reflect a little bit.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's great. And those links will be very helpful. Thank you.
Yep, I will
Thank you.
look for them now while the session is still open.
Great. I was just going to say we're just about out of time, so maybe another minute or so. If anyone has any final comments.
Yeah, I would like to just. I'm really sorry. There was a mix-up in the times, and I just realized that you were 1 hour earlier than I had in my agenda. So the work of Radio La Benevolencia, the entertainment education work that we do, deals exactly also with self-awareness, except that it makes a real effort to overcome reactance of the public when it is not when the target audience is not captive, like it is in educational activities. Yes, so I would really appreciate to get more information on this. I'll read your chapter of the amount of things that I have very carefully. I would also like very much if you guys could read what we are doing, because I believe in the future we should really cooperate. I think in terms of teaching self-awareness and the psychology, in terms of creating your own resilience on the side of the audience instead of only focusing on the leaders, that is really what we do as well, except we are doing it in entertainment education and you are doing it in straight education, and there is really room for cooperation there. I would really like that. Just want to say that.
Yes, I appreciate it. Let's be in touch and follow up on this.
Okay, so I can receive a recording of this
Yes.
and also notes. Thank you.
Yes, we'll have the recording up in the next few days. I just want to take this chance again to thank you, Katya and Shelia, for your presentation. And we will continue these webinars next week again. And we're going to have 6 more over the next 6 Wednesdays. So please join us. You can find the links on Eventbrite. And thank you again, everyone. Take care. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much.